Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you for the kind words of introduction, and thank you for the wonderful work the Rockefeller Foundation does. Thank you for the 12 commitments you have made at the Clinton Global Initiative and all the good they've done, and the some $4 million you've invested in our common work around the world, and everything from the Health Access Initiative to our efforts to combat climate change through slowing deforestation. You ought to get your own innovation award just for bringing all these fascinating people together tonight. I'd like to also say how profoundly honored I am to be here with the previous honorees, especially the children from Wickham Elementary and their spokesperson, their teacher. And Sania, congratulations to you. And to Jane Weru, thank you for that incredibly moving speech. Right before I got up here, Mary Robinson, who served as president with me when we were together in our former lives, said, "Do a good job. You're the only man going up there tonight." And so, you know, and all I can say is that one of the joys of the modern world, for all of its madness, is how much more interesting it is, right? I mean, look at this crowd tonight. If we'd had a meeting about this and the donors and the contributors to the Rockefeller Foundation, we'd done this 30 or 40 years ago, an overwhelming majority of the people here would look like me, old gray-haired white guys in suits. And all I can tell you is I'm grateful that my demographic has not yet been completely erased from the agenda. I have many friends and colleagues here, and I'm almost reluctant to get into mentioning them, but I do want to thank Dan Glickman, my former Secretary of Agriculture, my great friend Orson Porter, who worked with me in the White House, my hero, Dr. Paul Farmer. I hope I live to see him get the Nobel Peace Prize. My colleague, Mary Robinson, Loretta Brennan, Declan Kelly, all my friends from Ireland. We stick together through good times and bad. At one time, we never thought the bad would return. And a special word of thanks to a man who's been a real role model to me for now almost 30 years, Dr. Muhammad Yunus. Thank you for being here. I met Yunus in 1983 in Washington, D.C. I talked to him for 2 hours, and I called Hillary, and I said, "You know what we need in rural Arkansas? We need microcredit." And we established America's first rural microcredit bank. And then when I became president, we gave the first funds ever to establish both community development banks and microcredit programs within other banks throughout America. And I'm proud to say that President Obama revived the program in his first year in office. And I say that to make this point to all of you. This innovation is catchy and catching. And it's really important. And Judith's going to ask me some questions in a minute, so I will try to truncate my remarks, but I do want to make 2 or 3 really important points. It is clear to me that the modern world, for all of its joys, is threatened everywhere, in rich and poor countries and those in between alike, by 3 enormous challenges. It is entirely too unequal. That's why we love Jane's remarks about how could I practice law, right? If half of the people I was practicing for could never walk through the office and weren't citizens. It's unequal in incomes and education and access to health care and access to capital and access many places to basic civil rights. It's too unequal. I've been saying that for 20 years. Finally, people are beginning to take it seriously. I ran on this when I ran for president in 1992. You don't have to be a populist, and you don't have to be against wealth. I'm all for people getting rich. I just think everybody else ought to have their chance too. It is entirely too unstable. Look how fast the financial crisis spread from the United States across the world. Look at our shared vulnerability to terror. Look at the political instability around the world, some of which in the Arab Spring may work out just fine, some of which is deeply troubling. I think it is a metaphor for the interdependence of the modern world and the positive and negative aspects of it that the president of Greece, or the prime minister, Mr. Papandreou, and the leader of the opposition were roommates in school together as children. And they're trying to decide whether the opposition should continue to demand that the prime minister step down or they actually ought to roll up their sleeves and work together to save the country. If you look at the political dysfunction in America today, I'll say more about this in a minute, but I was in my office in Harlem today, and my assistant keeps CNN on kind of without volume all day long. And I looked in there, and there was one of the Tea Party spokesmen said, "We consider compromise a weakness. All or nothing." They ought to read that wonderful book, Being Wrong. Have you seen that book? Last 2 years, written by a female journalist from New York. It's a brilliant book with a sweeping grasp of philosophy and physics and all points in between. But it basically says we need to embrace our errors and not be ashamed of them, because that will enable us to learn from our mistakes and be more creative. And that the whole culture of worrying about either thinking you're always right or being paralyzed by the fear of being wrong is totally inconsistent with solving the problems of the modern world. So it's an unequal, unstable world. And finally, it is totally unsustainable because of the way we produce and consume energy and the way we produce and consume other resources, including but not limited to food and water. And innovation can make a difference. An old friend of mine was in the office today talking about a company that she was involved with an Indian entrepreneur that now can provide clean water that's cholera resistant, 20 liters for 7 cents, roughly a tenth the cost of the nearest competitor. This is the kind of thing that will save the world. And the thing that bothers me about the world we're living in, even though the problems of rich and poor countries are profoundly different, I'll just parenthesis. Take Haiti, for example, where it's the hardest thing I've ever tried to do, in some ways one of the most wonderful things, because the people are smart and they work hard and they're incredibly gifted and they've never had a good government that was worthy of their talents and their dreams. Really poor places don't have the systems that enabled all of us to get to these chairs tonight. Look at the stuff you're taking for granted. You don't have a second thought when you drink the water. You'd be shocked if the lights went out or if the microphone failed. Some of you might be happy, but you'd be shocked. I spent a lot of my life in places where people can't take any of that for granted. Somehow you found a way to get enough education and opportunity to have clothes on your back and you're not hungry when you go to bed at night. And there are a lot of people that don't have that. So in those places, we have to build systems. We have to build the education and the economic and the finance and the health and all the social systems, including competent, honest government. Now, rich countries, they have all that. That's how they got rich. But they lose the spirit of innovation at some point, and this is not just the U.S. or any other wealthy country. It's every civilization since the Sumerians. Because once you reach a certain amount of prosperity and you built up a certain infrastructure to support it, pretty soon people worry more about holding on to their positions and advancing the purposes for which their operations were established, holding on to present gain instead of creating a brighter future. I personally think that that's the challenge in America today. I think we're in trouble today for two reasons. If you look at this crazy little thing over over whether we're going to raise the debt limit, which is not voting to undertake new debt, it's voting to honor spending decisions already made by the people that now don't want to pay for the decisions they've already made. 30 years ago, we adopted two bad ideas. One is that the government is the problem. Therefore, there is no such thing as a good program or a bad program cut, no such thing as a good tax or a bad tax cut, no such thing as a good regulation or a bad deregulation. There's no evidence to support it, by the way, but it animates a certain ideological certitude that is paralyzing in a world where what works is what you just heard about. What did we just celebrate? Smart people getting together, looking at the facts, talking to people across lines, and figuring out cooperative ways to solve these problems. The other idea began to be taught in business schools about 30 years ago, and I'm almost the last generation of people who could have gone to business school and learned what was taught in America from the New Deal forward till somewhere in the mid-70s, which is that corporations are creatures of the state and have responsibilities to all their stakeholders, their shareholders, their employees, their customers, and the communities of which they're a part. Now, it's shareholders only, and you better show up every quarter, and it doesn't matter what happens. Unfortunately, in the pressures of the day, you just can't worry about all these other people, except insofar as they are necessary to make you satisfy your shareholders. Both those ideas will not get us to a world where there is less inequality, less instability, and more sustainability. And the third real problem we've got is that conflict makes wonderful politics and hideous policy. You look at all the places around the world that are succeeding today, there is not a single successful country on the face of the earth that does not have both a good economy and a good government. And in the United States, there are these clusters of places that are just booming in this economy. In Orlando, for example, is my favorite example. You have Disney World and the Universal theme park and a huge video game operation and the Defense Department, collectively spending billions of dollars a year on computer simulations. Why? Because they make going to theme parks more exciting, they make more interesting video games, and they save the Defense Department a ton of money in training people. And they have cooperative arrangements between all these people and the government and the University of Central Florida, the biggest, not very famous university in America with 53,000 students. And they're creating islands of opportunity. Former mayor of Pittsburgh is here tonight. Ask him how Pittsburgh came back. Look at what's happening in Cleveland. Look at what's happening in San Diego, the Biotech Center of America. It all works because of cooperation, not conflict. It all works because nobody claims to have the truth all the time, and nobody's interested in scoring cheap points by dividing people. And the same thing is true everywhere in the world. What works today is cooperation, and it's often boring politics. The other day, we had a huge moment. You've seen all these debates about whether the health care reform in America is a disaster or a good thing. And nobody ever says when you read about this that we're spending 17.2% of our income on health care, and no other rich country spends more than 10.5%. That's Canada. All the other OECD countries of any size are between 9 and 10.5. That's $1 trillion a year we spend. We wouldn't spend if we had any other country's system, right? And everybody who was opposed to it said, this is a disaster. In this 1,100-page bill, the one sentence that was driving the demands for repeal was this one. From now on, 85% of your insurance premium has to go to your health care, not profits or promotion. So 2 weeks ago, we had what I thought was a truly momentous announcement. Ask yourself, if you're an American citizen, if you even heard this. You know, I'm home alone a lot. So I have ridiculous amounts of time to read newspapers and blogs and all that. So the biggest insurance company in the United States, Aetna, and one of the best, by the way, puts out this announcement that they have filed a petition with the Commissioner of Insurance in their home state, Connecticut, to cut insurance premiums in America 10% across the board because of the 85% requirement after a decade in which health care costs have gone up at 3 times the rate of inflation, and nobody in America knows it. Why? Because nobody called anybody else a name, and the loudest voices on talk radio don't want you to know about it. And this is a bad model for us. I thought to myself, how could we learn from these wonderful kids from California, or our honoree from Pakistan, or our honoree from Kenya, about how to do this? And I'll just close with this. Judith was kind enough to mention the 2 most famous of our foundation's innovations. First of all, I have to tell you that a lot of the credit for the global initiative goes to Doug Band, who's sitting out there with me, because he's the first person who told me we ought to have a meeting like this. And a lot of the credit for what we did on AIDS drugs goes to our magaziner, because he's the first person I called when I found out the Bahamans were paying $3,500 or $3,600 for $500 drugs. And I said, Ira, this is ridiculous. I said, you or I, will you help me do this? He said, yes. I said, okay, first thing one of us got to do is call India and tell them to stop going through 2 agents and send them drugs direct to the Bahamas, and I'll do whatever's necessary to guarantee the price. And I thought the rest of it would be that easy. It turned out not to be. That just took 4 days. But it put us on this pathway. Cooperation. None of my Indian and South African drug suppliers are making less money than they were before. They're making more money in a different way that helps keep more people alive. I never ask any of our people to lose money. I told them, I said, if you lose money doing this, well, forget about it. But we didn't do that. The government of Ireland and the government of Canada were the first 2 governments to promise me, before there was a PEPFAR, before there was a global fund, that they would spend up to $20 million a year in countries they got to select to guarantee this new price model. We didn't do anything in the Clinton Global Initiative that would have been possible if it hadn't been for sponsors like Rockefeller that gave us the means to create a vast global network. People ask me all the time in these little interviews, well, what do you think the most important thing you did as president was? And surely it was creating all those jobs and everything. And I said, for the relevance of the modern world, it might be that we moved 100 times more people from poverty to the middle class than in the 20 years on both sides of me in just those 8 years. 100 times. And I say that because we weren't anti-business. We weren't anti-tax. We had government spending at about 19.5% of income and taxes at about 20%, and we took our debt from 62% of our income down to 33%, and we were on the way to being debt-free. We're back up to 70 now. So I say that to say, you all need to keep this in mind. Your story is emblematic of how the world has to work. Sometimes you have to stand up against an oppressive government. Sometimes you have to scream at one who won't hear you. But in the end, we will not succeed in being truly innovative without good economies, good governments, and good NGO environments. Cooperation breeds creativity. Innovation, more and more, is not something that's cooked up in one genius's brain. It's the product of common endeavors of people living in the conditions they wish to change. And so wherever you're from and whatever you think, keep doing it, because the politics sooner or later will have to follow what works if you touch enough people. Thank you for everything you do. God bless you.